Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Brookings. I'm Mike O'Hanlon with the Foreign Policy Program and the Africa Security Initiative, and we're delighted to have you here with us today, along with Reuben, Brigety, and Ken Opalo, to talk about the state of democracy in Africa at a very important time. It's always an important time in a continent with 54 countries, making their gradual way forward on the path of economic development and democracy development. But we have particularly interesting situations in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, some interesting and somewhat hopeful developments in places like Ethiopia, some more mixed situations in places like Zimbabwe, and a whole lot of other stuff to talk about as well. We will look forward to your involvement about halfway through. I will go to you for your questions and thoughts, and we look forward very much to those. But we'll begin up here with a bit of discussion, and we're going to try to take broad stock of how we see trends on the continent, and then maybe hone in on a few key countries where the panelists have particular interest or expertise, and that'll be a way to set up the discussion with you. In our handout that you may have grabbed on the way in, and just for anybody else who's interested, we tried to take some of the Freedom House information or estimates of trends in democracy in Africa to remind people of sort of where we stand in broad historical sweep. Like certain parts of Europe, like certain parts of the entire world, democracy has seen some slippage in the last decade in Africa. And we now have an estimate that maybe there are 3 or 4 fewer countries rated as free by Freedom House than had been the case just 10 years ago. But this is still an enormously improved landscape compared to where we were, let's say, in the Cold War, when I was a Peace Corps volunteer in the former Zaire in the early 1990s, when Africa had maybe 1 or 2 democracies, depending on how you counted, and now we're up to more like 10 or 9 ballpark. And then a lot of countries that are rated as partly free, that are showing some hopeful signs, some of which we discussed in more detail here in previous ASI events, like Kenya and Tanzania, where there may not be perfect democracy, but there is hopefulness. So if you look at the color-coded map, what you tend to see is that Southern Africa is rated as free, the very tip of Southern Africa. A few of the island nations are rated as free. A couple of countries in West Africa, relatively smaller countries, are assessed as free. And then large chunks of the rest of West Africa and East Africa are broadly viewed as partly free. And then the center of the continent, sort of starting with my old DRC and going upward through the Sudans and so forth, is generally seen as not free. And that continues up through the Sahel and into northern Africa. That's just a very broad brush. Just I want to frame the conversation, and now we'll launch in. Ambassador Reuben Brigety was the American representative, the permanent representative to the African Union in Addis Ababa during the Obama years. He had had other jobs in the State Department previously as well. He went to Annapolis and was a naval officer in the early years of his career, really a remarkable portfolio, and he's now the dean of the Elliott School at George Washington University. It's just a thrill to have you here today to join us. And we'll begin with him in just a moment because of his job thinking about the entire African Union and representing American interests in that dialogue recently. I think he's well positioned to help us begin to frame how we should think about trends in democracy in Africa. Ken Opalo, also delighted to have here, is an affiliate of Brookings, but a professor at Georgetown and a graduate of Yale and Stanford, a native of Kenya, a political scientist. He's consulted for the World Bank. He's done a number of other kinds of research projects. He has ongoing research on Kenya and Tanzania, as well as some of the parts of democracy we sometimes overlook or tread too quickly over, the legislative role, some of the local roles that my friends have talked about here in previous events on Kenya, for example, where we've seen a lot of democracy at the local level, sometimes doing better than at the national level. Ken studied at different echelons of institutional development throughout much of Africa. And so, again, his expertise at the moment in some of his research is largely on East Africa, but he certainly takes a broader purview when considering the overall trends in democracy. And so without further ado, let me launch right in and ask the Ambassador Brigety, if he could just take stock of how you look at things coming back recently from your ambassadorship in Addis Ababa and thinking about what you saw during that period, what you've witnessed throughout your career. How should we feel about the overall state of democracy in Africa today?
Sure. Well, good morning, Michael. It's an honor to be here, and Professor Opalo as well. It's great to see a number of friends and colleagues in the audience. Let me also say in particular Ambassador Reddick, good morning. And as our friends of the African Union say, all of the protocols observed. So as my friend and colleague, Ambassador Michelle Gavin, who was ambassador to Botswana under President Obama, said, she had this great observation, which I steal shamelessly anytime I sort of speak on a topic such as this, and that is that Africa is big enough and diverse enough that you can find almost any fact pattern to support almost any view you want about trends. So with that in mind, and I know that we'll talk about specific countries in a few minutes, but let me kind of give you my macro view of democracy on the continent, and it's on a few points. First of all, as Fariza Karia and Larry Diamond and others have said, it's really important when you think about democracy anywhere in the world, you're not thinking just about elections, but you're thinking about the series of not only governmental processes, cultural habits, social norms that inhabit a particular country and by which it decides to govern itself. So what one can think about that obviously in the context of Africa, not only looking at how elections have occurred or have been stalled, but also, quite frankly, taking a look at both established and emerging norms, both positively and negatively as it relates to democratic practice. I think there are a couple of places, for example, where you can say there have been reasonable elections like Zimbabwe, but I'm not sure that we would call them sort of full democracies. In other places where there have been quite dramatic events like Ethiopia, where there have been some really quite dramatic moves as it relates to opening up political space, despite the fact they've yet to have a full, free election since the dramatic political changes there earlier this year. So that's the first issue. The second issue, I would say, is that the political commitment to democracy per se is still very much there at the level of both the African Union and the regional economic communities. Nobody on the continent, for example, is saying, like they were in the late 1970s, that I am president for life because that is simply how it should be, that is actually the case. To the extent that we see any kind of backsliding on the continent, it is because through various ways of subterfuting the very notion of democracy itself. So whether it be in the DRC, where there's been this notion for the last 4 years that, gosh, gee, we really would like to be democratic, we just can't figure out how to organize an election for 4 years. Or you have the so-called constitutional coups in places like Uganda and Rwanda, where there have been these sort of notions that, of course, we have a democracy, but part of being a democracy is for the people's will to change the constitutions if they like, to make sure that Paul Kagame or where Museveni can stay in power for extended periods of time. And here's why that matters. The notion that democracy itself is no longer being challenged gives you a very important foothold at the level of the African Union, at the level of the regional economic communities, to continue to hold countries to account when they tend to fall short, either in terms of process or in terms of established democratic norms. The third issue, which I think is crucially important, I've written about this elsewhere, is that unlike in Europe after the Cold War, where there was essentially an internal dynamic, an internal sort of centripetal force that the EU created as a magnet to attract those countries in Eastern Europe to adopt democratic practices as a means of necessity to both joining the European Union and also to a lesser extent NATO. There's not an inherent intrinsic democratic attractive force in Africa itself to be able to force or encourage many of those African states to achieve democratic practice. In fact, and I know this sounds contradictory to what I just said, but sort of bear with me for a moment. And in fact, there are a series of external forces, principally the Chinese, which are not only providing economic incentives, but also through essentially their own version of soft power, making the argument that not only is it unnecessary to link economic prosperity with a particular form of political organization. But actually, look what we did. We've lifted 1 billion people out of poverty by focusing on economic growth and a centralized political model. And if that worked for us, then surely it can work for you, South Africa, Uganda, Ethiopia, elsewhere. And the reason that is important is that I, for one, am deeply disturbed by the lack of an active democracy agenda by the United States in Africa right now. Because even our European friends, who frankly are increasingly focused on their own internal issues at the moment, are not providing the sort of external incentives that are necessary, external sort of pushes on a diplomatic level, on a programmatic level, et cetera, to help African states continue to hold true to the democratic norms that they have established for themselves at the regional and continental level. And absent that, it's like a game of chess. You can sort of see how this is going to play out 5 moves ahead. Or to put it differently, there's no reason to think that absent a serious external democratic partner, that there will be substantial endogenous movement to resist the Chinese approach to economic development and political reform on the continent for the long term. And there is no rational way of thinking in which that is actually in support of American interest long term on the continent, or to let alone what I would argue, nor is it in support of the long term interest as increasingly articulated by the massive youth bulge on the continent themselves. So even as the extent that the Chinese are engaging with senior and increasingly aging political leaders on the continent and political elite, there is clear demand from the younger, socially connected, social media connected, entrepreneurial young people on the continent for increasing political reform, for increasing political openness, tied with increasing economic opportunities. And I frankly think that the United States needs to be a leader in supporting that regard.
Great. So before going to Ken, thank you. A very crisp and comprehensive way of framing it, and yet very pithy as well. I think I heard you say not only that we should keep our eye on issues besides national level presidential elections, focus on legislative, focus on courts, focus on local means of building democracy. But then I heard a hopeful element to your message that democracy is no longer challenged as a concept, but then I heard a very worried ending, that you feel that we're sort of maybe losing traction in terms of the right kind of foreign example, the right kind of American policy at a time when Africa doesn't have quite the sort of role model or sense of momentum or buy-in to specific forward motion. There may be a general acceptance of the concept of democracy, but it's losing a little bit of its vigor and its momentum at the moment, and that's partly because of American policy.
I think that's all right. If I could just have just one sort of caveat. Despite the fact that those things may seem contradictory on the surface, they're not mutually exclusive in practice. And one of the things that I often say, certainly to our students, and I think it's true in foreign policy, is across the board, not only in Africa, it's very important for policymakers to have a sense of strategic imagination, which is to say, to be able to see possibilities on the horizon, both positively and negatively, and then understand how, absent interventions one way or another, things will trend. Right. And I think that, again, one can see this playing out. It is vitally important for the United States to lead the way to support endogenous democracy in Africa if you want to be, not only, frankly, from our own experience, help the continent to achieve their own aspirations, but also, quite frankly, from a more narrow national interest perspective, to ensure that the majority of these 54 countries on the continent will increasingly look to the United States and to the West for their partnerships in the decades to come, as opposed to looking further to the East.
Fantastic. Ken, same question to you. I'd just love your overall assessment of how you see your native continent going these days, and we can get to your native country in a minute, but overall trend lines for democracy in Africa. Are you more hopeful or more worried, or maybe both?
First of all, thank you for having me. I think I'd probably say I'm more hopeful, perhaps a little bit more than the Dean, in terms of even the China influence. And I'll begin there because, if if my general assessment would be that for a long time, the West spent a lot of time and energy and money on governance and not enough on government. Government being, being able to deliver goods and services to citizens. So, all talk was about elections and, no corruption, without thinking through, okay, what does that mean for having water, having roads, having power, etc. Enter China, which, and let me give you an example of Ghana. So the first time I went to Ghana in 2006, Accra was very dusty. The tallest building, if I remember correctly, was a post office, which is a 5-story dilapidated building. Accra now, I've been going back since, has, major highways. There's a downtown. Kotoka has a new wing. You can see all kinds of progress. Some of it is because of the oil. Some of it is because of Chinese loans, which are problematic, and maybe we'll talk about that towards the end. But at the same time, there's movement. You can see movement in physical infrastructure, roads everywhere on the continent, power generation on the continent is on the up. These are the things that, if you can step back and think of democratic theory, these are the sort of ingredients that will create the economic prosperity and provide a basis for support for democracy in the long run. Now, China, at the same time, doesn't influence local politics in positive ways, if you may put it that way. But even in that regard, I see the Chinese influence as creating a divergence, and I think this will be the trend moving forward. So in already democratic countries, or quasi-democratic countries, I'm thinking Ghana and Kenya, perhaps even Benin, Senegal, as the good examples here, Chinese involvement has made it possible for governments to get stuff done, right? So, Kibaki was able to, in Kenya, build a bunch of roads, increase power generation, which then, has created popular demand for his successor to do similar things, right? In Ghana, the previous administration had done a few big things, which again creates democratic pressure for the next government to do something different, bigger and better, right? So in those countries, the strengthening of government capacity to get stuff done, coupled with electoral competition, will likely push them in the right direction. As when you think of democracy as a means of keeping elected leaders accountable and giving them incentives to provide goods, public goods and services for the citizenry. Now, you also have, your Rwandas and Ethiopias and likely Angola now, even, with the new openings recently, countries that will stay autocratic. Tanzania is in this group as well. They'll stay autocratic under hegemonic parties, CCM, EPRDF, etc. They will use access Chinese loans to, build roads, connect households to water supplies, connect households to the grid. But they'll stay autocratic and give the excuse that, if you want more roads, you have to let us, be able to shut off your internet whenever we feel like. I remember about 5 years ago, I had a conversation with an Ethiopian opposition activist who's now head of the Electoral Commission. And, she told me very frankly that even in Ethiopia, it's very hard to argue against roads and power, right? If the government has the capacity to get that done, it's very difficult for opposition groups in these countries to then come along and say, hey, forget about the roads for now, you need good governance, and then we'll provide the roads, right? People want to see governments doing things. And to the extent that China has been able to make that happen for a number of African countries, it's pushing them, either to be more accountable if they're already democratic or less accountable, but still under the pressure to provide public goods and services. Because even Paul Kagame, if Rwanda were to enter a recession for 2-3 years, I doubt that he would stay in power, right? He would have to be a lot more repressive, and there'd probably be backlash. So even the autocratic countries now have incentive to try and deliver or be seen to deliver. And finally, I think the youth, it's key to talk about youth and urbanization in Africa and what that means for democracy moving forward. It's something that we don't talk much about, but within our lifetime, more than half of Africans will be living in towns and cities. They'll need jobs. That will create incentive for populist politics in ways that we haven't seen yet on the continent, right? So urban Africans will be a lot more de-ethnicized. They'll be a lot more prone to populist appeals. And that will, reshape electoral politics in Africa in ways that we're not thinking about yet.
Yeah, your points are well taken in terms of thinking about the trade-offs, not trade-offs, but tension when different kinds of regimes emphasize more democracy and openness versus more economic development. As I peruse the Freedom House map, it's sort of striking to think that Ethiopia scores worse than, Niger. And I think if I was going to live in one of those countries, I know where I would choose. And it's not all about, therefore, pleasing Freedom House. And yet we also can't really condone a leader just staying on indefinitely under the guise of being inevitably necessary for that country, because someday even a Paul Kagame is going to be mortal or experience a recession. So it's a complex motif. I guess as we move into a more specific round of discussion of certain countries, I'd love to ask you each what your bellwether countries are, or just the ones that you want to say something about where you feel there's an important trend, good or bad. And Africa is not a continent where you can easily identify a list of pivotal states that everybody would agree on, but clearly there are 6 or 8 countries that, in size at least, and in clout, tend to be bigger than others. Nobody could fail to mention Nigeria, right. A quarter of the population of sub-Saharan Africa. South Africa is the other big economy historically. Kenya and Tanzania, my old Peace Corps country of DRC, and Ethiopia. These would have to make any short list. But feel free to add or subtract from my short list. I'm just going to begin this round of asking you each which countries would you want to say some additional words about. Please pick 1 or 2, and we can. I'm sure the audience is going to bring us to the others that we don't get to quickly here in this opening. But I just want to be provocative and say that as I try to answer my own question about whether to be optimistic or pessimistic about trend lines in power transitions and democracy in Africa, I can't help but be obsessed with my old Peace Corps country right now. Elections are scheduled in DRC for December 23rd. If those go passably well, I think this is a huge boost forward, because that will be combined, as I see it, with, not so bad trends in Nigeria, Kenya, Tanzania. Glass half full, maybe 52, 55% full in each of those by my non-expert assessment, and you can disagree in a second when I ask you to comment. Ethiopia, still not scoring well with Freedom House, but doing some interesting things with Eritrea, with its own domestic politics. And so as we look at the big countries in Africa, if DRC can somehow show some hopefulness with this election, and then what comes out of the election in terms of governance and in terms of services and security, then I will start to sort of get my positive hopefulness back, and it'll help me resolve the tension that, Ambassador, you just highlighted, where there are both good things and bad things happening, and we don't want to oversimplify. So that's my provocation to you. Feel free, please, to respond on DRC or anything else. I remain modestly hopeful about DRC's elections. Nothing has completely thrown them off the rails yet, but I'm still nervous as could be that something will go wrong, either before Election Day or in the counting of the votes. And so it's a very, very guarded sense of hopefulness on my part. But over to each of you.
I will accept your provocation.
Please.
In 2 ways. First of all, we have a wealth of experience in the room, so I will be provocative in return. In my observation and in my experience, there is not a bellwether country in Africa that tends to affect other countries as they relate to governance. There tend to be, to the extent that there are trends, they tend to be regional. Both because the economies tend to be more closely linked, and also, quite frankly, because those heads of state tend to know each other really quite well. So, Southern Africa, obviously, what happens in South Africa, obviously inherently impacts, Zim, Botswana, et cetera. DRC, you can't talk about DRC without talking about Rwanda. Nigeria, obviously, for all of West Africa, et cetera, and Kenya and Ethiopia as relates to East Africa. Having said all that, in my view, the most interesting story in all of Africa right now is Ethiopia. The changes that are happening there are extraordinary in and of themselves. They are extraordinary relative to where Ethiopia was a year ago. They are extraordinary given both the economic, political, strategic, and military importance of Ethiopia, the second most populous country in all of Africa, the headquarters diplomatically of all of Africa. They are extraordinary because of this extraordinary new prime minister, Dr. Abiy, who is making moves that are really, really incredible. I would argue it's actually one of the most interesting stories in all the world, not only in all of Africa, and particularly as it relates to rapprochement with Eritrea. And the one thing that I would disagree with Professor Opalo about relates to the trends in Ethiopia with regard to the unitary state, the EPRDF, and whatnot. And on this point, I've been to Ethiopia 4 times this year alone. I'll be going back again in December. And I think you can't underestimate how close that country really was to the brink in January of this year. They really, really looked into the abyss. And through a series of extraordinary steps that are arguably without parallel in 2 millennia of Ethiopian history, have stepped back from it. Now, it would appear that Dr. Abiy, he's playing a really fine really difficult political game in the sense that he understands that these reforms have to be institutionalized, that there are parts of the EPRDF, particularly the TPLF, the Tigray Party from the north, that are not at all happy with many of the changes that are being made. But also understands that there is no way to go back to where things were before. That if these reforms do not succeed, there is no plausible return to a repressive state because the Oromo and others simply will not have it. The option is either reform going forward or some really bad things happening in the country if one goes back. Which doesn't mean that reform is inevitable. It just means that I think that going back to the sort of the notion of the kind of like unitary development repressive state of the last 20 years, I think is not likely. It's either going to be much better or much worse than it was before. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I guess I should have clarified that I'm thinking more of a CCM, in Tanzania, a hegemonic party that runs elections, grants the opposition the space to win 25% of the vote, but never really threatening the ruling party. I would definitely agree that Ethiopia is a bellwether for the Horn of Africa region, with implications for Eritrea, Djibouti, Somalia, Sudan even, South Sudan. But in East Africa, I would actually, within the East African Cooperation region, Tanzania is a big one because what happens in Tanzania will determine whether you'll have Kenya and Tanzania being on the side of democracy and democratic governance, versus Rwanda and Uganda, or just have Kenya and Kenya when push comes to shove will typically sided with economic interests versus pushing for reform in the region. So what happens in Tanzania will have implications for Rwanda and Burundi and Uganda as Museveni continues to hang on as a life president. Then in West Africa, 2 countries, Togo. So Togo remains unreformed, and I spent 5 months in Togo last year, and throughout that period, there were weekly protests. Sometimes Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, with huge turnout. But because of the president's links within ECOWAS, one of the heads of ECOWAS is a brother-in-law, and the Eyadema family retains power as a result. I think whatever happens in Togo will send a strong signal to the Sahelian states about what's acceptable as a means of governance. And then finally, Cote d'Ivoire. We don't talk much about Francophone Africa on this side of the Atlantic, but Cote d'Ivoire has a big transition coming up, and I think being the biggest francophone West African country, what happens there will have implications again for the Sahel and the other francophone states outside of Senegal. If there's enough diplomatic pressure to ensure that the transition is well managed, the elections are passably competitive, and there's no locking out of southern candidates from contention, that will go a long way in securing the remarkable rebound that they've had since the Civil War.
So let me just ask one more question of each of you. Thank you. Those were great comments with the specificity on Ethiopia and then sort of a broader view from Ken. I want to feel free to answer either or both or neither of these questions, but they are where my mind goes listening to you both. First, I do want to come back to DRC, and I realize neither one of you may be as much of a specialist on that country as you are on East Africa or Ethiopia or what have you, but what does your gut tell you about the likelihood of an acceptable outcome in this election? And by that I simply mean no blatant theft of the election by the Kabila regime in effect, or no large-scale violence of whatever cause, and then a peaceful transition of power. What does your gut tell you about the prospects of that happening? That's question one. The other question, as you say, Reuben, Rwanda and DRC are so inherently linked. If you were to have a chance to talk to President Kagame, and maybe you have, and he was here a year ago in the next auditorium over, but we didn't bring the subject up to his face. If he was sort of the MC for that, and the lead speaker. If you were to have a conversation with him and try to persuade him why he has to not be a president for life, what would you say? Because we know what his answer is, right? We know that he says, Rwanda needs me. Right. It's not yet stable. Don't forget the genocide is still in the adult lifetime of many of us. Don't forget we're growing 8-10% a year. Right. That creates some opportunities down the road for my successor, but only if we get to the place where we all have buy-in to this growing economy. What's the right way to persuade someone like him that, in fact, he's already been in power long enough and it's time to not run again? So those are my two questions. They're connected, but you could answer one or the other.
One of the great things about no longer serving in the government of the United States is you can speak one's mind much more freely, at least for now. I don't share your optimism about the DRC, which is not to say that I don't wish peace and prosperity for the people of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I don't share the optimism for two basic reasons. The first is there's nothing in the historical record of the DRC to suggest that there will be a free and fair election that will lead to a process of democratic reform that will link to long-term widespread economic prosperity for the country. DRC has all the makings for a prosperous country for all of its citizens, and it has never come even close to being able to achieve it. Which leads me to my second point, which may get me in trouble one day. But it is such a big, unwieldy country that it's hard. It is yet to demonstrate the ability to govern itself coherently as a country, even under Mobutu, arguably, for any reasonable length of time. So I am not as optimistic, but I would love to be proven wrong, both by the people of the DRC and also by other observers.
By the way, just for the record, I am at most guardedly hopeful. I don't think I used the word optimistic. Right. If I did, let me correct myself. Right. And we've had numerous events the last 2 years on DRC here, partly because we think the only hope is to just keep up the drumbeat of pressure and attention. But anyway, sorry to interrupt.
And then to your second question about, the longevity of leadership, and this is true not only in Africa, it's true in lots of other places. In my observation, it is very rare that anybody who stays in power for an extended period of time does so purely, solely because in their heart of hearts, they absolutely believe that if they are not in power, the country will completely fall apart. There is almost always a series of ulterior motives as it relates to their own survival, their own prosperity, their own sense of ego, and also the survival and prosperity of the people around them that continue to incentivize them to hang on. So my argument to President Kagame would be an argument that I would make to many other leaders in the position if I were so presented. And that is not only, obviously is it important for your own country to be able to develop and cultivate the next generation of leadership, but you can have a great life. We actually need more examples of the Haile Mariams, of the and the Mandelas of the world. They're like, look, leave, go on the Davos speaking circuit. Get a house in Disney World, whatever. I mean, whatever it is that floats your boat. Enjoy being an elder statesman, because the flip side is that not that you kind of die peacefully, the revered sort of father of the nation. It's that if you hang on too long, bad things will happen to you. See Muammar Gaddafi, and that is a very rational calculation that I think most people would understand.
Thank you. Fantastic. Ken, to you.
Yeah, I think I'll start with Rwanda. I guess, my approach would be complementary to the ambassadors, but instead of focusing on Kagame, I would probably focus on the elites around him, right? Because, with Mugabe, with Museveni, after a certain point, it no longer becomes about the guy at the top, but the people around him who can't afford him to have him leave.
That's right.
So convincing those people that the alternative models like exist in Angola, Mozambique, and Tanzania of maintaining the architecture of rule, but rotating leadership at the top, so that you don't put all your eggs in one basket and risk collapse in the absence of Kagame. So thinking about how do you institutionalize the elite class around the president in ways that are stable for the long run, because if you're not going to become a democracy, then maybe you're better off being a CCM-style government, which is halfway there. Now, on the DRC, I am also not hopeful. Kabila's sort of decision to step down almost sounded too good to be true when I first heard it. It stuck, which is great, but I don't think he and the commercial interests around him will let power go. But we could be surprised by the election, right? The election could go the other way for him. And now, I guess the one glimmer of hope when I look at the DRC is the recent reforms in regional governments, the increase in the number of provinces. Initially, I was skeptical because it seemed like a power grab by Kabila, divide the provinces to divide the hinterland elites. But I think in the long run, this will provide opportunities for local government and local accountable democracy in interesting ways. Because, the DRC is a huge country, right? We tend to forget. It's really hard it's hard enough to govern, a small country like Malawi, right? Governing the DRC without sufficient infrastructure all the way from Kinshasa is a massive undertaking. So it's probably best that the country is the intensity of government is increasing with these newer regions. And I think, if I were advising, say, the State Department, it would be, to focus on making sure that at least some of the, one of the regional provincial governments are strong enough to begin to provide a demonstration effect as to what can happen when you combine elections with effective government.
I've got some more questions on DRC, but I'll hold them off for now. Maybe we'll come back to that later, or maybe somebody else in the audience will bring us to that, or some other country. So now it's your turn. Please wait for a microphone. We'll start here. There are two questions about the fifth and sixth row. Let's take them both, please, and then come back to the panel.
Thank you, and good morning. I'm wondering what impact the Mo Ibrahim Prize is having that provides, I think, a $5 million prize for a leader that practices a range of criteria leading to good governance. Is it acting as any kind of incentive for good governance and democracy building?
Thank you. And I should have said, please identify yourself before you hand the mic.
My name is Kim Weichel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Scott Morgan, Red Eagle Enterprises. I do freelance security and threat analysis. three countries which I've been focused on my writing recently. I'm wondering what your impact on. One is Gabon, with the recent health of the Bongo. Second one is Central African Republic, with the presence of the Russian mercenaries. And the third one is the elephant in the room here in Washington. That's the ongoing violence in Cameroon, with repeated deaths of Catholic priests, U.S. missionaries, seminary students, which, frankly, Capitol Hill doesn't seem to give a rat's rear end about.
So why don't we come back to the panel now and start with you, Ken?
Yeah, so I think about 4 years ago, I calculated what it would take to convince Museveni to leave office, right? 5 million doesn't get you there, right? The present value of being president in Uganda, assuming he only steals about 10% of GDP, is a lot more than $5 million, right? So the Mo Ibrahim prize is great, but it selects for leaders who are already willing to step down, not, it's not a pull factor. It's an incentive for people who are already predisposed to leave office. So yeah, I don't think such prizes would force these leaders out. Only people around them can force them out. So maybe thinking of a Mo Ibrahim prize for elites around the president to incentivize them to push this old man out would be a better idea.
Thank you.
I will echo that. I've talked with Mo about this on a number of occasions, and I think he deserves enormous credit for putting his money where his mouth is to try to incentivize and to recognize this. I think the problem is that the theory of the case is a little incorrect, which is to say that for most African heads of state, well, for a subset of African heads of state that try to cling to power to this point, $5 million is not sufficient. However, I do think that the demonstration effect is important. One of the things that former Prime Minister Haile Mariam of Ethiopia said that not too long ago is when he's traveling and he's hanging out with other current heads of state. They say, "So, how's it going?" He's like, "Oh, I'm enjoying my life in Addis." They're like, "You still live in Addis Ababa?" He's like, "Yeah, it's great." On the premise that he has demonstrated that one can peacefully leave power and stay at home and continue to contribute to one's country. And the more models there are like that, the more one can say to a Museveni or Kagame about their thought calculus, that it is increasingly unlikely that you will be able to stay in power forever peacefully. And where do you want to place your bets? And don't you want to be kind of the celebrated person on the Davos circuit that can be a great spokesman, elder statesman, as it were, for the continent, as opposed to a pariah, even if you're still alive?
Scott, I'm going to answer your question indirectly because I don't know enough about the three countries that you mentioned to waste your time or anybody else's. But I will say the following in a broader sense. I'm concerned about the reduction in resources for AFRICOM. Because I think that at a time when we're prioritizing great power competition again in defense strategy, as we should, we need to remember that some of that competition is happening in Africa. And the role of AFRICOM on the continent is pretty modest, a lot of value for the dollar, and not necessarily in competition with the other things we need to do to be prepared for long-term competition in a more military sense with Russia or China. And so I actually think that, while I understand to the extent Secretary Mattis, General Dunford feel they can't really keep an eye on every kinetic operation and that we have to be careful about getting into more of those, as revealed with the tragic killing of the 4 servicemen a year ago. Nonetheless, the idea of building capacity in places like CAR or Cameroon or Gabon or wherever, and trying to maintain relationships and give the message that Reuben mentioned earlier, that the United States is engaged on Africa policy writ large, is a message that we should want to keep sending, not pulling back from. And so AFRICOM always got a bad name because it was created in 2008 at the end of the Bush administration. It was seen as one more example of the militarization of American foreign policy by that unilateralist Bush administration. This was, to my mind, always a silly critique. I thought AFRICOM was a way to organize our efforts better continent-wide to get maximum value for relatively modest or minimal investment, and other parts of the U.S. government needed to emulate AFRICOM rather than have a sort of Washington critique form that somehow this reflected a militarization of U.S. policy towards Africa. So I'm concerned about that trend, and I would like to see it reversed.
Can I say two things about Cameroon and Gabon? So I think these two countries, a reminder of the tension within the West of democracy promotion, right? So, I think if the EU and France in particular were serious, Bongo would not be president because he probably would have lost the previous election. And Biya would have stepped down already, right? The absurdity of Biya flying in from Geneva, voting, going back to Geneva, then flying back to Cameroon to be sworn in. This only happens because the EU and France in particular, and the companies that benefit from these two family, the family in Gabon and Biya in power in Cameroon, they're the ones keeping them in power, right? So, and I think this kind of lets us focus on it's not a new tension, it's an old tension that the West has had. On the one hand, having a pro-democracy rhetoric, but on the other hand, when the rubber meets the road and logging companies, oil companies need specific families and individuals in power, then democracy takes the back seat. And I think Gabon and Cameroon are very strong examples of that, because if those two countries get unlocked, then Central Africa, including all the way to the DRC, will begin to see openings. But Cameroon, the Republic of Congo, Gabon, and up in CAR, and even in Chad, those countries remain locked in autocracy, in part because of their economic and security importance for the EU and France in particular.
And again, that's sort of that blue swath of countries in Freedom House's assessment that just gobbles up the whole center of the map where there isn't a lot of hopeful pro-democracy movement. Okay, let's go to round two. Woman in about the sixth row, and then the gentleman right next to her. Yes, please.
My name is Carol Connors.
There's a microphone for you.
Oh, but I'm so loud, I'm not sure I really need it.
Oh, we want to hear you well.
My name is Carol Connors, and I have to confess that my affections are with Southern Africa, where I've been a few times and have friends. My question is this: would you please discuss citizen identification with tribe over country and its resultant lack of attention to corruption with the elected government and those who the elected government appoints?
Do you mean in the United States or in Africa?
Beautiful.
Sir.
Yes. My question is just if you could comment a bit on the difference between the colonization style, English colonization and French colonization. I see that French colonization, colonized country like DRC, are much more, are less able to make it through democracy. Could you just comment on this difference between British colonization or French colonization in Africa?
Of course, DRC was Belgian, but could you identify yourself, please?
My name is Archibald Hamilton.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ken.
I can take the ethnic politics question. I think I tell my students all the time that all borders are arbitrary, right? A mountain is a border until we can blast through it. A river is a border, a natural border, until we can build a bridge over it. And that's true for Africa's borders and the problems of ethnicity that they create, right? So I think ethnic politics is often not a reflection of the arbitrariness of a country's borders, but the inability of the country to govern properly, right? Strong countries minimize the effect of ethnicity. It's when countries begin to fray at the center and services begin to become conditional on ethnic affiliation, or the behavior of leaders in office begin to reflect the tribal commitments, that ethnicity and ethnic politics becomes very toxic, right? I'm sure everyone in the room is aware of these dynamics these days, right? Ethnicity is endogenous to how countries govern. And I think to the extent that ethnicity is a problem in African politics, it's partly because government has never been the strong suit of African states. Right? States have been very weak in the center, so the very little services they provide have been rationed along ethnic lines. And that makes it very difficult for citizens to see themselves as part of of one huge country. That's not to say that, Africans do not have strong affiliations with their countries, right? The DRC is one of, I give this example all the time, right? Big country, all sorts of problems, but I think if there's one thing Mobutu did right was create a Congolese identity, right? Congolese people are very proud of their country. It should have split many, many years ago, right? But the Congo stays together because people think of themselves as Congolese, and I think that is it's a very rich well waiting to be tapped by national leadership that are willing to invest in stateness and government in ways that make people appreciate their countries more.
If I can add a bit on the ethnic politics question, I was only being slightly tongue-in-cheek with regard to this question. And the reason is that I would argue that increasingly these questions of subnational identities that feel irreducible, whether it be by clan, by broader ethnic group, by religious group, are not in play only in Africa. And increasingly, at this moment of increasing nationalism across the world, they are impacting increasingly our politics throughout the democratic West, to include here in the United States as well. And so the interesting question for me isn't simply this kind of like perpetual question that Africa has always been plagued by all of these so-called tribal identities that play into making the state weak. The more interesting question for my purposes is how can one support stronger governance at the state level for the purposes of delivering on fundamental needs of the populations, and how can we have those politics increasingly be based on the policies of the government of the day as opposed to first being determined by ethnic identity. And that is a question that is absolutely as applicable in the United States of America in 2018 as it is in Tanzania or Ethiopia or Rwanda.
And I'm just going to take up the question about the age-old historical debate, the British versus the French, and I'm not going to defend my Belgian friends in DRC. But I am going to suggest that again, this Freedom House map, it has all sorts of limitations, although I'm very happy they do it. If I just go through this map and I look at the countries that are in green, the 9 countries that are considered to be free, I don't see any strong correlation with who colonized them. In fact, I see Mauritius and Sao Tome and Principe and a few other places that have very Latino-sounding names scoring well, Senegal, and then I also see English-speaking countries. And then if you look at East Africa, yes, you have Kenya and Tanzania that are scoring reasonably well, but you also have, who would have thunk it, Mozambique coming out of horrible civil war and showing some promise, and Ken's alluded to them a couple of times earlier. And then West Africa, the countries that are evaluated as partly free, it's sort of a equal mix, roughly, of French-speaking and English-speaking, as I do just a quick calculation in my head. So I don't necessarily, it's getting to be 60 years ago, and sure, colonization continues to have a legacy, but I'm not sure I see a strong a priori correlation in terms of where there's freedom today with who colonized in the past.
Can I be provocative on colonialism? I wait for the day when African countries, and most of them are getting close to having been independent for longer than they were colonized, right? I think in the long durée, people will look back at colonialism at this 70-year blip, and it was very it was a very quick 70 years because if you think of colonialism and its hegemony, colonial states weren't strong until the interwar period. And then World War II happened and they had to give up. So you're right that colonialism created a lot of problems for post-colonial states, but it was also a very brief experience and a tragic but brief experience that if we think in the long run, I think I say this because I feel like for most post-colonial African elites, there's a lot more focus on undoing colonialism and not enough focus on what was there before, how did colonialism unwind what existed before, and how can you go back to build on what existed before to have stronger states moving forward. Now, this is not to downplay the tragic, path dependence influences of colonialism and neocolonialism after. It's just to say that sometimes we overplay how much deterministic its influences are.
Thank you. Another round here. We'll stay. The gentleman here in the fourth row, my good buddy, and then we'll come to the front row as well for this round, and then we'll go back to you guys in ensuing discussions.
Great, thanks. Sasha Lezhnev from the Enough Project. I will refrain from commenting on the DRC, which is the country I focus on.
And thank you for what you did in the fall to help us think it through earlier, Sasha.
Oh, yeah, sure, absolutely. Thanks for having me. So one quick comment and one question. My comment is particularly in an era of dwindling resources. It seems to me that the U.S. and European states as well need to be doing more to use their financial leverage on some of these countries to facilitate the democratization aims. Again, era of dwindling resources, but corruption and lack of freeness or lack of democratic change seems to me very closely linked with corruption. And there needs to be more accountability, more use of the U.S. Network sanctions and other tools, anti-money laundering measures, work with the private sector, particularly correspondent banks who are processing 74% of transactions from Africa originating or being conducted in euros or dollars, according to SWIFT. So there's a lot of leverage there that I think we need to be making much more use of. That's a comment. Question on the youth. I'm curious where you all see this as going, the youth movements on democratization. So, for example, in the DRC, we have a very elderly, one of the presidential candidates is 90 years old. So a very elderly political class that is not really in touch with the population. In fact, most of the pro-democracy youth movements in Congo are very fed up with the opposition, particularly after the recent debacles. So, I'm curious where you see this is going. In Ethiopia, you're seeing a fairly youthful leader. Do you think that is kind of where the trend is going, or are we likely to see more Arab Spring type of scenarios in sub-Saharan Africa that we haven't really seen? So curious on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasha. And let's come to the front row here for another question before we come back to the panel.
Hi, I'm Max Bone, and I'm a student at the Elliott School. I'm curious if you could talk a bit about what role the African Union could play in encouraging countries to democratize, because in multiple crises across the continent right now, be it Cameroon or whatnot, it seems that the African Union is not playing that large of a role, aside from issuing periodic statements, because aside from ECOWAS, it seems that there's been no real regional economic body or the AU doing much to push towards democratization.
You want to start this round?
Yeah. So if I may, let me sort of start with your comment with regard to economic leverage. We were talking a little bit in the green room before this. One of my great frustrations with the current Trump administration's approach to Africa is that even if you accept their general worldview of America first and preference for bilateral trading relationships, a very transactional sort of approach to the world, even if you accept all that, there is an obvious big picture strategic play they could be making on the continent. And that obvious play is to have a series of political framework discussions with both individual African countries or regional blocs or the AU itself to figure out collectively how they can create structures to support American businesses to engage on the continent in support of African-defined economic objectives, whether it be figuring out how to get more American infrastructure companies in support of, for the PIDA, the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, how to really catalyze American agribusinesses on the ground, and to have, as part of that framework, everything from focusing not simply on the bottom line cost of the contract, in which case we'd almost always be beat out by the Chinese, but also focusing on labor standards for African nationals, focusing on questions of transparency and rule of law, and demonstrating how all these sorts of things can actually help in the on the medium to long term actually strengthen and grow the overall economic pie in individual African states. That is an obvious public-private partnership for our government and also our companies that ought to be, in my view, like the starting point for American engagement on the continent at this point of political history of our respective countries. So I'm quite disappointed that that is not yet happening. I maintain hope that the Trump administration will increase movement in that regard. As relates to, and then on the youth point, I suspect that if you talk to most African leaders and their affiliated entourage, the thing that most of them are absolutely scared of is not invasion by a foreign neighbor. It's not the collapse of their economy. It is they are profoundly concerned about the youth populations in their own countries. And here's the thing. Many of the older African leaders at one point were young African leaders. Right. So at one point, I think Kagame and Museveni are sort of the Paul Biya as well, are sort of like the prototypical examples of this, of the sort of the young guns that were at 20, 30 years ago, longer, 40, were sort of came to power, and they're the ones that were going to change, and then they get sort of comfortable, and at the same time as they've gotten comfortable, they are sitting on this massive youth bulge. That is not prepared to wait 40 years for their turn to live prosperous lives with meaning in their own countries. So those leaders that figure out not only how to incorporate that youthful energy in their political systems, but also create space economically for them, will be the ones that will be remembered not only for posterity, but also will be able to live out the rest of their lives in broad respect and dignity. And those that don't, I think, will frankly pay the price. Which gets back to your earlier question of what's the argument that you would make. And to Max's question about the role of the AU, there are lots of ways to answer that question, but I think probably the simplest one in which I would say is that one of the biggest challenges of the African Union as relates to promotion of democracy and governance is they are under-resourced. They don't have the resources to send long-term conflict resolution mediation missions at a moment's notice when they need to. They certainly don't have the capacity to do long-term elections monitoring or electoral support. Now, they have done, frankly, some really important behind-the-scenes work in Burkina Faso, also in Nigeria, elsewhere. In my view, they've not accomplished what they should have in Burundi. They're effectively a non-factor in Egypt. But it goes back to what I said at the beginning. You can find their performance has basically been uneven. And to the extent that it has been uneven, it's resulted to two things. One is either a lack of funding to be able to do long-term support, and then the other is the extent to which the union itself is frankly undermined or sidelined by the regional leadership, regional heads of state, who would prefer to see an outcome that is separate from what either the Peace and Security Council might mandate or what the Constitutive Act would suggest ought to be the appropriate outcome.
Super.
And quick note on the youth. I think two interesting cases on the continent may be emblematic of what could happen. Beginning in South Africa with the EFF, beginning with, roads must fall, fees must fall, and the EFF still hasn't been completely able to tap into the overwhelming, youth support for rapid change and renegotiation of the post-apartheid settlement in South Africa. I think such, populist settlements will continue to grow as more, youth become urbanized and demand for, quicker reforms for jobs and general well-being. Then, the other example is up north in Uganda. So when Bobi Wine was arrested and then, had to leave the country for medical treatment, internet was shut down in Uganda briefly, at least Twitter was. And what happened is that, the Kenyan youth picked up the tab and were, tweeting everything about Uganda. And for a brief moment, there were even young Kenyan MPs who tried to go to Uganda to mobilize Ugandans in Kampala. And again, like with the EFF, the sign for this were the red berets that the young Ugandans were wearing. So, it's possible that an EFF-style movement, could creep up north of the Limpopo and especially in East Africa, galvanize people across borders, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, so that you can have, a pan-national youth movement of a populist, style of politics that's different from, this current style, which is typically dominated by people who are 50 plus because they have the money and the time to participate in politics. Then finally, on the AU, I think the ambassador is right that sub-regional, these regional economic communities are perhaps the best place to anchor democracy promotion. Because, if the EU tries to push for reforms in Burundi, but within the East African community, Uganda and Rwanda have violated term limits, that's not going to fly. Right? It's hard to push for reforms in Central Africa within ECAS if, Cameroon and Gabon are the biggest and strongest economies. Even in Southern Africa within SADC, South Africa sat on its hands with Zimbabwe blowing up, in part because, the racial nature of land politics in Zimbabwe was a reflection of what obtained in South Africa. So, if you talk land reform in Zimbabwe, you'll be forced to talk land reform in South Africa. That's something that the ANC was not willing to do. So, Zimbabwe just happened because they couldn't do much about it.
I want to follow up before we go back to the audience for another round with each of you on this question of youth and more generally demographics. And we know that Africa is projected to experience the largest population growth of any continent in the 21st century. In fact, most of the world will not really grow much in population, but Africa may add 3 billion more mouths in the course of the century. And I've noticed that in the course of my career, this issue has been one that seems to recede from the public policy discussion. And anytime one talks about whether that kind of a demographic trend is healthy or not, it can sound a little bit preachy or, no one wants to endorse China-style population plateauing. And yet I wonder if with climate trends, with demographic trends, if over the longer term we can really be hopeful about African democracy if we see that many more people come into a continent where there probably isn't going to be enough land and enough jobs for most of them. So do we have to actually integrate the democracy discussion with the demographic discussion if we're thinking long term?
I think you also have to integrate those two plus the economic discussion and development discussion. And that would be the case even if, frankly, demographic trends were flat or rising at a much more nominal rate. But here's the thing. Several things are going to happen. The only question is to what extent they will, each one of these things will dominate. One, a lot of these young people will leave. They will continue to leave. The migration patterns that we're seeing coming across the Mediterranean, over the Red Sea. I mean, this is just the tip of the iceberg. It's going to get a lot worse, particularly as job opportunities continue to decrease. The second is that, nevertheless, it remains a potential for a large, cheap labor pool to displace, China and East Asia as sort of the manufacturing capital of the world if, and this is a big if African countries take advantage of the necessary macroeconomic policies and industrial policies in order to address it. And the third thing is that it will absolutely impact national politics in each of these countries. The leaders will not be able to continue to sit on sclerotic political governance mechanisms without making substantial accommodations to this massive use pressure from below. And the only question is, do they do it in a way that is healthy for their countries and healthy for these young people, or they do it in a way that's much more oppressive and therefore exacerbates the first problem of flight and also internal strife.
Ken, any
Yeah,
comment?
I mean, I guess I'm less alarmed by the demographic trends than most people right now, because our current projections are based on the recent experience, which hasn't yet factored in massive improvements in enrollment in primary and secondary school on the continent, especially among girls. So Tanzania went from, I think, 33% to above 66% enrollment rates just over the last 10 years. That will mean that young women will their total fertility will drop at some point. So the trends are I guess for policymakers, yes, they should be thinking, what does an Africa with 3 billion people look like, or Nigeria with 300 million people look like? But I think the trends right now, at least from where I sit, are not as scary as they look. In part because we should admit that for a long time Africa was terribly underpopulated, right? And that the lack of population was a cause of the region's underdevelopment, right? Even now, labor is still more expensive in Kenya than in Vietnam, right? So, before Africa is able to reap this demographic dividend that leaders are talking about now, we have to think critically. How do you make labor cheap? Instead of thinking how do you reduce the number of mouths before thinking of ways to make labor cheap. And then finally, I think, assuming the trends hold, the political scientist in me is kind of hopeful that, if the trends hold, then there will be greater demand for political reform in Africa, right? Because your typical African government these days, runs a formal economy and forgets about the informal economy, right? Because there's still land, people can grow their own food and eco living. Now, when there's no more land and you have to manage the entire economy responsibly from the center, then that will create a demand for better government. And not, an FDI-focused kind of administration that only cares about the 2% of the labor force that's in the formal sector and forgets about the rest of the economy.
Thank you. Let's go to another round. Gentleman back in the 5th or 6th row, right, and then we'll come up here in the 2nd row, and then the 1st row. So we'll do 3 in this round.
Thank you very much. I'm Lawrence Manzi from Rwanda. I returned from Rwanda 2 weeks ago, and I can't. The truth is as if I've gone to another planet. Being in Rwanda, you see a vibrancy. You see a more focused and a youth and a population that has a purpose in what they are doing. They are part of a bigger thing, and it's true when you hear Ambassador Brigety. I think if we say it's a one-man show, President Kagame, he would have been good speaking at Davos and doing whatever and becoming a statesman. But then I think we in these discussions, we come to a one man instead of looking at this person belongs to a system. There is a bigger system that has a plan, probably would look at what's happening. We are looking at a person looking at his exit and forming leaders that will come after him. Look at his cabinet, the youngest on the continent or wherever. Look at his party just elected the majority in the parliament. He has the youngest members of parliament. He has the majority inclusivity of women now at over 60, still at the leadership. But I think those ones show that he's not this person who has come and says, I'm here to stay and I'm the answer. I think there is much bigger thing that Rwanda has in and is doing to ensure this peaceful transition, that when we come to such a discussion and we focus on one person who is at the top, we may lose if we are to advise or guide, we may lose the
Thank you.
point.
We did talk a lot about the people below leaders, but I take your point on it's interesting point on the ministers that he's trying to form. Up here in the first and second rows, please.
Thank you. My name is Michael Armeo. I'm with Verax Labs. We're a firm that monitors emerging and frontier markets for investment opportunities. My question today is both general and specific. If the panel had any thoughts on North Africa, whether or not we see any opportunities there or any progress there. And then specifically, I was curious about Tunisia, where can we say that perhaps Tunisia is a bellwether for success in democratization? And if we can agree on that, or even say that's possible, if there were thoughts on the sheer number of returning jihadists coming back to Tunisia, and could that possibly jeopardize any positive progress there?
Thank you. And then the gentleman here in the front row.
Oh, I'm sorry, excuse me.
Thank you. My name is Femi Akibi. I'm a Nigerian. Thanks for this brief dialogue about the continent. My quick question. One, at one point will the African continent start to move towards an African Union election? So my suggestion, and that I want your opinion, is there any way we could start to have election regionally? Maybe 10 years down the line or 5 years down the line? And lastly, as I heard about the youth and what they're doing, what do we do in regards, it may not be for you guys, in regards to the disruptive digital technology called blockchain that West Virginia uses for the election currently, and some other application in the global supply, corruption, and so forth. What are your take on this technology, and what the youth could use this technology to take over the continent?
Okay, good. So we've got specific questions on Rwanda and Tunisia, and then a more general question on elections. Do you want to start, Ken?
Yes, so I'll start with elections. Incidentally, I'm currently working on a paper that tries to look at, so a number of African countries, about 26 of them, adopted technology as a way of cleaning up elections. So biometric voter registration and identification at the polls, etc. Turns out that the use of technology in elections is just cheap talk. It's a very expensive way of signaling to donors and election observers that, hey, look at us, we're using technology, we're trying to run clean and fair elections. If you look at the data from Uganda, it's almost comical that a country that used BVR technology in its elections, Museveni was very transparent in where these systems were deployed, where they failed on election day, and things of that nature. So when it comes to technology and its use in politics, even in governance, I think that if Paul Biya or Kagame wants to be corrupt, they will be corrupt even with technology, right? If presidents and elites in power want to be corrupt and to rig elections, they'll do it even when there are elections. If you can't do it on election day, you'll do it at voter registration stage or create insecurity so people don't show up. So I think while elections technology makes elections easier to conduct, I think we shouldn't lose focus on the very kind of naughty political solutions that we need to have as a precursor to the use of technology.
Great. Ambassador.
I would argue that North Africa is the most heterogeneous region of the continent, which I think is partly to explain why the Arab Maghreb Union is probably the weakest of all the regional. I mean, that plus obviously Morocco and Algeria and those issues. So Tunisia, however, is a fascinating case study. It is, I think, the country in North Africa, indisputably, that's had the most dramatic political reform. It's the one that I think potentially, if I had to bet on long-term political stability for the purpose of long-term economic investment, eventually I would argue that Tunisia is probably the right bet relative to Algeria, which is bruising for a reckoning. depending on what happens to how much longer Bouteflika comes, because there is no succession plan to speak of for what happens when he passes inevitably. Egypt has yet another strongman in al-Sisi that has sort of gone back to pharaonic type, as it were. Morocco is still trying to figure out how African they are in terms of what their relationship is with the rest of the continent. Libya's a basket case, obviously, with no sort of end in sight. I think the problem of the transit point for jihadists, I think, is true across the Sahel. I think we probably got to see it most strongly in Tunisia, precisely because the potential for serious political reform there is the one that is the most likely to be upset by the kind of jihadist element that, unless the government is able to secure itself more stringently. But I unfortunately don't see, even if Tunisia turns into the Sweden of North Africa, I don't see how it necessarily is a bellwether for what happens in the rest of the states of the region, because the politics there are so fundamentally sui generis by state, and also, particularly in the case of Algeria and Morocco, the nature of those of the enmity between those two is so profound. That it is almost the organizing principle for their, certainly in the case of Algeria, the organizing principle for their foreign policy with regard to each other. But I wish Tunisia really well, and I think, again, if I had to sort of make a long-term bet, that's the country in the region that I would make the best bet on.
I'm just going to add one quick word for our Rwandan friend. Not that I claim expertise on Rwanda, but I am fascinated by it. I think it's very important for what it does as an example for the rest of the region. As you say, there are a lot of good things that have happened in Rwanda, a lot of amazing things in 25 years. But we also know that President Kagame has been implicated in some questionable suppression of political opposition. And I feel like the U.S. government dialogue needs to continue to pressure him to prove that what you just said is true. Let's keep having that conversation. Who are the people who are going to succeed you? And at what point is there going to be a fair election? I think we're beyond the honeymoon phase where we just Google our eyes at the amazing accomplishments in Rwanda. It's all too fragile because Kagame has himself made it about one guy. No matter, he himself has insisted he must stay, and he hasn't sent the message to the world that you sent much better than I've ever heard him send. So let's keep the pressure on, and if he can make that argument convincingly, we can all be happy. But I'm skeptical. I want to make sure, by the way, Sasha, I'm going to give you a little bit of notice that I'm going to ask you to have a final word on DRC in the final round as well. But we'll also, of course, come to our panelists. I'd like to hear your take on whether you're at all hopeful about December 23rd. But before we do that, let's get a couple more questions for these panelists, and then we'll do one final set of responses. And I know I haven't called on too much in the back of the room, so...
Can I respectfully suggest you call on Ambassador Reddick?
Yes, let's do that. And then we will come up here for a couple more.
Thank you very much. I'm Eunice Reddick, U.S. State Department, retired. I just want to go back to one of the early points. Perhaps we could return to the China issue, or the China problem. China growing as a major source of financing for infrastructure projects across Africa. Loans that are out there, again, that could disrupt economies in the future. So very much a player on the economic scene. But what I've seen, politically, again, is China possibly using these countries in Africa as sources of support in international fora to avoid, for example, a Uyghur issue coming up in the Human Rights Council, or possibly to counter these attacks in the South China Sea. But again, not seeing the effects necessarily on the domestic scene across Africa. I think there's been more of an effect from the U.S., again, being absent on these issues that we used to be present on, from democratization to governance issues. But I just want to go back again, where do you see China having a greater influence, perhaps on the political scene, and also on the economic scene, given this growing presence and the interconnection between Beijing and the continent?
Thank you. Let's take one more, and then we're going to wrap up here. So, I think we're a gentleman here in the second row, and then we'll give the microphone to Sasha and then come back to the panel.
Mr. O'Hanlon,
Yes, sir.
you made mention about the Freedom House. Freedom House lists China as not free. What about Africa using indigenous principles of society? I'm sure you're familiar with the word Ujima. Well, why not use something like that? Why do we have to use some foreign ideals of how a society should conduct itself? Can you comment on that?
Okay, good. So we'll come back to the panel in just a second. But first, Sasha, I'm sorry to ambush you, but any word you have on just your take on how things are going in DRC?
Sure. I am fairly pessimistic in terms of what if this is going to be a credible, free and fair, or transparent election. But I do think that there's still a window for the U.S. and Europe to engage and help influence and impact that process. I believe that all signs right now are that, you know, through the, as you mentioned, not just the election day, but the whole electoral process to date, in terms of, you know, the candidates that are able to register, the organizations and parties that are allowed to mobilize rallies, the activists who are allowed to protest or not, et cetera, and these voting machines that seem to be will be used. I believe that all signs are that Kabila and his inner circle of family and businesses, et cetera, are setting up to rule through Manuel Ramazani Shadari. So I do think, however, that the U.S. should not adopt a wait-and-see approach here, that there's a chance to really influence the process. I think that once there's a new government, there will be a very, there'll be sort of like, okay, let's restart policy and not put pressure. So I think the time now is to really put more pressure on the government and use those financial tools. By the way, the House today is going to vote on the Congo Democracy Act. It's going to happen this evening, and it's very likely to pass. So we're waiting for the Senate to introduce that version, and that will include some sanctions requirements, the more extended period, but nevertheless puts pressure on the administration to do that. So I think that, you know, right now is a really important time to engage proactively and not sort of sit and think, well, let's hope it goes well, kind of thing, and that kind of thing. So thanks.
Thank you. Great. Appreciate it. Ken, and then
Yeah.
the
So,
ambassador.
you know, I'll start with the ambassador's question on China. I think, you know, I think it's important for everyone involved when we think about China and Africa to step back and kind of appreciate both the positive and negative influences, right? And also look at the issue from the African perspective, right? Because if you're an African politician who, say, was in power through the 90s, right? You went through a period whereby all you ever got from the West were probably lectures on democracy and accountability, some funding for health, right, and capacity building workshops for governance reforms, and little else, right? While, you know, your people were demanding for actual services. Then enter China, a country that's willing to provide that. They're not doing it in the best way possible, right? You know, Chinese engineers are not fostering local skills transfer. They're building a lot of white elephants, right, that are fueling corruption on the continent. But it's also true that, you know, the previous model of Angola selling all its oil to Exxon with all the money ending up in a Swiss bank account has kind of shifted. And what you have is, you know, Angola, yes, the elite are still skimming off billions of dollars. But some of that oil money is paid for in kind with roads and buildings and water systems that Angolans can see. And, you know, if you talk to the African middle class, this is an improvement, right? It's not the case that, you know, all the money was stolen, is stolen. Now you have a system that delivers on tangible infrastructure that's going to provide, you know, a basis for economic growth. And I think, you know, because we focus so much on the governance implications of China's involvement in Africa, we tend to forget the interests that inform Chinese sort of involvement in Africa. The game has shifted, and people realize that, and even within the research world, we realize that we actually don't know whether reforming governance automatically leads to growth, right? The consensus appears to be that good institutions and good government co-evolves with economic development. And I think from a policy perspective, it's probably not a good strategy to insist that you must reform before you can grow. Instead, have an all hands on deck approach, so that if the U.S. and the U.S. still has a lot of soft power in Africa, could think of leveraging Chinese infrastructure investments with strengthening of governance in ways that complement this very sort of massive growth. Because the last thing the U.S. wants to be seen as doing is pushing out China that has delivered. And if you look at opinion surveys, China is very popular in Africa, right? Because people see the power, people see the roads, people see things changing. And so, I think net, it's been a positive influence despite the negative influences on governance. And I think, it's hard to reform governance from the outside. And which brings me to your point. I think eventually Africans will have to figure out democracy on their own, right? It's very hard to train elites and the citizens to vote for the right leaders, right? And governance reforms have typically been decoupled from the real life, right? Governance was always about the elites and constraining them, as opposed to governance as tying elites to the citizenry through service delivery. What China has done is strengthen the service delivery arm of governance, and I think what the West could continue doing is strengthen the accountability arm, but knowing that the service delivery arm is crucial, right? It's not okay to want people to queue for hours to vote without service delivery, right? Democracy collapses when there's no service delivery. So China is strengthening service delivery, and I think in the long run that's a good thing.
Great, thank you.
If I can just conclude by saying this. So the inverse to my earlier statement about the joy of the freedom of a former U.S. official to speak one's mind is that I remain a committed American citizen, committed to America's interests in the world. And thus, I have a harder time taking a full academic detachment to my observations in other parts of the world, particularly as it relates to Africa. So what I take away from your question is one of the most compelling arguments for why Africa policy should matter to our overall foreign policy globally. And that is that there are 54 sovereign countries on the continent, each one of which has a sovereign vote in every multilateral institution to which they belong. And each one of them is capable to very greater or lesser degrees of being courted for their own influence by other countries, whether those countries be our friends or our adversaries. And notwithstanding the quite significant contributions that China has made and is likely to continue to make with regard to infrastructure development on the continent, I think we also need to be very clear-eyed that globally speaking, they are not our friends. We are to various degrees in a series of competitions with China across the world. And in the Africa context, we are absolutely in quite substantial danger of losing influence on the continent in ways that not only impact our interests in Africa, but in ways that also impact our interests in other parts of the world by virtue of African states seeing their interests more closely aligned with our Chinese counterparts than with ourselves. And that's a point that I think, frankly, is not sufficiently understood here in Washington by many of our colleagues that are engaged in trying to advance America's interests around the world.
I'll just say one very brief word of closing in response to your question, sir, which is that too often that kind of an argument can be used as an excuse for an established regime to hold onto power or to pass power to a chosen successor. I think in principle, there's no reason that we have to have elections as the only way that a democratic will can be spoken, but we also know that there's no real good alternative to democracy. And I think, actually, if anything, I would want to double down as an American and remind Americans that elections do not generate democracy by themselves. We've forgotten that in Iraq. We've forgotten that in other places in the modern era, where we strive for a big national ballot on something and assume we can hand off a baton or consider mission accomplished at that point. In fact, as our previous panels this fall have underscored, as Senator Coons underscored, as these gentlemen have underscored, as the founding fathers told us, democracy means checks and balances. It means protection for the rights of the individual. It means the rule of law. It means strong courts. And it means local governance that's also effective, not just a national winner-take-all vote. So to me, that's the problem, not so much that there are better indigenous models that would work better, but that we Americans need to remember that democracy does not just equal elections when we're proselytizing and trying to help people build their own systems of government. Sure, if there is some other model that emerges that can be defended, fine, but I'd be suspicious usually when that argument is used that someone's trying to hold on to something rather than let the will of the people speak. But I know we can all continue to discuss and debate this in the future, so let me wish you the very best for December and the holidays, and please join me in thanking the panel.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.